On November 10, 1980, an aspiring actress named Valerie McDonald went missing in San Francisco. The investigation into her disappearance uncovered a truly bizarre case involving the CIA, a satanic cult, and maybe the strangest group of criminals you'll ever encounter. From the start, the details about Valerie McDonald's disappearance were very odd. McDonald, who was described as stunningly beautiful, lived in an $80 a month room at the Tower Apartments, which was possibly the sleaziest building in San Francisco at the time, notorious for housing drug addicts and felons. It was never explained why McDonald, who had a master's degree and was from a well-off family, was living in such horrendous conditions. After her disappearance, police suspected John Gordon Abbott and Phillip Arthur Thompson, who were the managers for the Tower Apartments. They were hardened criminals who'd been recently released from San Quentin, and then both were strangely hired as managers for the Tower Apartments. Police learned that, right before she vanished, Valerie McDonald had been told by a friend of Abbott and Thompson's that he could get her a role in a Dustin Hoffman film filming locally. But there was no movie, it was all a lie, and Valerie McDonald hadn't been seen since she left her apartment with him to go to the fake movie shoot. Police tried to question the two felons about Valerie McDonald's disappearance, but they had vanished, until a week later when Abbott was spotted at the US-Canadian border. He got into a shootout with police when they stopped him, an officer was shot, and an associate of Abbott's was killed in the shootout. Abbott survived, and he was found with Valerie McDonald's unemployment benefit cards, voter registration card, and the leather jacket she was last seen wearing. Police found Thompson hiding back in California. In his storage unit, they found a receipt for a recent purchase of 11 bags of quick-dry cement and digging equipment. Between the fake movie story, Abbott being found with her records, and the cement and digging equipment, it all pointed to the two felons being responsible for Valerie McDonald's disappearance. But despite a massive search, her body couldn't be found, and with no body, there was no way to bring charges against the men. The investigation became more and more intriguing as more was learned about Phillip Arthur Thompson and John Gordon Abbott, because they were two of the strangest criminals you'll ever encounter. Thompson had an absolutely massive criminal record and was convicted of a whopping 17 felonies in his 20s and 30s, everything from grand theft to murder to kidnap and rape of a 16-year-old girl. He was said to have a near-genius IQ, and a police investigator at the time described Thompson as the most interesting man he'd met in 22 years on the job. John Gordon Abbott also had a genius IQ level of over 160. His mother was a genetics professor, and his father was a major political player who served as the chief marketing economist for the United Nations. Abbott's criminal history is honestly about the most insane thing ever. Shootouts with police, multiple attempted murders, 2 escapes from prison, and he had millions of dollars of stolen property and a quote arsenal of automatic rifles in a warehouse. The two men were also planning possibly the most elaborate bank robbery in U.S. history. Police found plans with detailed maps of delivery routes, plus the names of bank staff and armored car drivers, and their addresses, social security numbers, and even the names of their children and where they went to school. The robberies would have netted them tens of millions of dollars and been potentially the biggest robbery haul in U.S. history had they been successful. Despite their extensive criminal activity, Abbott and Thompson had an uncanny ability to receive very light sentences or even have their cases not make it to trial. The fact that they were constantly arrested for murder and other serious crimes yet served so little prison time puzzled and frustrated police. They must live very charmed lives, one police sergeant commented at the time. But their charmed lives started to make sense when it was learned that the two felons had major connections to the CIA and the FBI. After one arrest, Abbott's wife claimed he was working with the CIA to sell guns to a paramilitary group in El Salvador, and Thompson was involved in CIA black operations during the Vietnam War. When Thompson was in jail, FBI agents even approached local deputies about releasing him. Now it makes no sense at all that the FBI would want a hardened criminal like this to be released, unless they were working together. In the 1970s, Thompson also worked for a White House group called the Intelligence Evaluation Committee, whose purpose was to intimidate radical anti-war protesters, and even kidnapping protesters was discussed. Thompson would have been working with G. Gordon Liddy and other very powerful people in the FBI on this committee. Thompson even worked as a driver for Richard Nixon's presidential campaign. And not surprisingly, no one really knows how someone with such an extensive criminal history was hired to work on a presidential campaign. During the search for Valerie McDonald, police speculated that she had uncovered the group's government criminal connections and was killed because of what she learned. But then more dead bodies started to turn up. and police began to wonder if there was another, even more sinister explanation for what happened to Valerie McDonald. On New Year's Day 1981, around a month after Valerie McDonald's disappearance, the body of another young, attractive female was found in San Francisco. Inez Saylor was shot twice in the head and 3 times in the chest, and strangely, in her pocket was Valerie McDonald's name and phone number. A few days before that, 2 more bodies had been found in Davis, California. A couple dubbed the Sweetheart Couple was found with their throats slit. And John Riggins just happened to be the paperboy for John Gordon Abbott in Davis. The manner the Sweetheart Couple had been killed in suggested the killing was part of a satanic ritual, a black magic sacrifice. Investigators learned that Valerie McDonald had seen satanic books and a medieval dagger in the men's Tower Apartments room, and it was believed the Sweetheart Couple had been killed with a medieval dagger. Years later, FBI agent Ted Gunderson gained quite a bit of notoriety for his investigations into satanic cults and ritual killings throughout the 1980s. He claimed Phillip Arthur Thompson and his wife were the high priest and priestess of a satanic cult in California at the time, and that Thompson had vowed to murder him when he was released from prison. Gunderson's revelations came years later. At the time, there was only speculation that Thompson and Abbott were into Satanism and had murdered these victims as part of a ritual sacrifice. But Valerie McDonald's body still hadn't been found, so there wasn't much of a case, until a big break finally happened decades later. And it suggested that this gang was possibly linked to even more crimes from that era. In 2001, skeletal remains found in Canada were identified as Valerie McDonald's. The location was near where Abbott got into the shootout with police shortly after her death. Despite pleas from Valerie McDonald's family, Abbott was never arrested for her murder. Abbott later resurfaced as a college professor in Japan, and years later he was found in New Zealand, owning millions of dollars worth of property that he'd paid cash for. Many suspected that these purchases were made with money he'd stolen from his life of crime. Even more interesting is what became of Phillip Thompson. In 2002, DNA found on Betty Kluwer, a woman raped and murdered in 1971, was tested and it matched to Thompson. In a groundbreaking court case, Thompson was convicted of the nearly 40-year-old murder in 2008. The investigation's lead detective believed Thompson was responsible for at least 8 to 10 other murders from that time. And the Kluwer case uncovered another very interesting connection. Because at the time of her death in 1971, it was thought that Betty Kluwer was a victim of the Zodiac Killer, who infamously claimed to have killed 37 people and terrorized the San Francisco area in the late 1960s, early 1970s. The Zodiac Killer was never identified, and with Thompson arrested for Kluwer's murder, online researchers began to investigate whether Thompson could be none other than the Zodiac Killer. Thompson and the Zodiac Killer were killing people in the same places at the same time. Thompson was in the Bay Area when the Zodiac killings were happening, and Thompson was taking Kluwer to Lake Tahoe when he raped and murdered her. Tahoe was shown in one of the Zodiac's taunting letters to police with the inscription Victim Number 12. And there may be more to the story. In his book Programmed to Kill, author Dave McGowan argues that most serial killers aren't psychopaths who kill because they're mentally disturbed, as they're typically depicted. Instead, these quote-unquote serial killings are often satanic ritual killings performed by groups of people. In other words, there was never a single Zodiac Killer, there were multiple Zodiac Killers, killing people not because they were mentally disturbed, but as part of satanic rituals. So could Thompson have been one of these Zodiac Killers? He was extremely violent, was connected to other murders in the area, and was reported to be a high priest for a satanic cult. At the time, there were so many serial killers and murders happening in the San Francisco area. These were mostly portrayed as random acts of violence with no relationship to one another, but some have speculated that many of these serial murders were actually connected. They were the work of a satanic cult, killing people as sacrifices, and that many of these serial killers from that era worked together. It's also interesting to note that Betty Kluwer was working as a drug informant when Thompson murdered her in 1971, and in 1976, Thompson was arrested for the murder of Ronald Winter, who was scheduled to testify in a case regarding the theft of weapons from Mather Air Force Base. In other words, both these murders that Thompson was convicted of don't appear to be random at all. It appears that he was getting rid of witnesses, and that his victims knew secrets. Now, if Thompson was indeed responsible for at least 8 to 10 other murders from that era, did those victims have secrets too? Which brings us back to Valerie McDonald. Was she killed as a satanic sacrifice, as was speculated at the time? Was she simply a struggling actress living in near-poverty conditions? Or was there more to her story too?